My mom and stepfather threw all my belongings out to make room for his kids, but when Grandma returned home, they faced the karma they deserved. In my formative years, my bond with my mother was unbreakable. We shared countless moments, from movie nights to weekend baking sessions. However, as I matured, our relationship underwent a seismic shift. When my mother remarried, suddenly everything seemed to unravel. Her new husband brought his own children into the picture, crowding our already cramped two-bedroom apartment. Space became a luxury, and in an attempt to accommodate everyone, my mother made a heart-wrenching decision. She packed my belongings into trash bags and discarded them. The sight of my cherished memories reduced to refuse left me utterly devastated. My eyes fell upon the remnants of my past life, photo albums, trophies, posters, and mementos that once adorned my walls. It was a painful realization that all I held dear had been callously tossed aside. I felt a profound sense of betrayal. How could my mother erase my existence, my accomplishments, my treasures? Fueled by a mix of anger and desperation, I confronted her, demanding an explanation for her cruel actions. In a fit of rage, I hurled hurtful words at her, questioning her choices and priorities. Regret washed over me, but at that moment my anguish drowned out reason. In the aftermath of our heated confrontation, I was consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt hostile and unwelcoming. Determined not to surrender my rightful place, I retrieved my discarded belongings from the trash. With unwavering resolve, I reclaimed my space in the apartment, refusing to be displaced by my mother's new family. As I boldly hauled my salvaged possessions back through the threshold of the apartment, a wave of astonishment crashed across my mother's features, her eyes widening in sheer incredulity. She lunged forward with feeble objections, her voice cracking as she insisted that what had been discarded could not be so easily resurrected or reclaimed, but my determination stood like an unyielding fortress, impervious to her pleas. This dwelling, with its weathered walls and faint sense of childhood suppers, was more than mere bricks and mortar. It was a living archive of my existence, reverberating with the laughter of simpler times and the quiet confidences shared in the dead of night. I refused, with every fiber of my being, to let this interloping new family, my mother's hastily assembled patchwork of step-siblings and second chances, wrest away the one anchor that tethered me to my sense of self. To yield would be to erase not just a room, but the very essence of who I was becoming in the shadow of such upheaval. Once inside the confines of what had always been my private haven, I set to work with a fervor that bordered on frenzy, methodically extracting each item from the crumpled trash bags as if piecing together the fragments of a shattered mosaic. My hands trembled not from weakness, but from the raw, unfiltered resolve to resurrect the sanctuary that had been so brutally violated. Posters that had captured my dreams, trophies etched with the sweat of forgotten victories, photo albums bulging with frozen smiles. These were not mere objects, but talismans of a life I had fought to build, thread by painstaking thread. I arranged them with deliberate care, hanging each memento in its rightful place, as though the act itself could stitch back the frayed edges of my reality. My mother hovered in the doorway like a specter of regret, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light, her voice a soft, imploring murmur begging me to cease this act of rebellion. "Please stop this," she whispered, her words laced with a desperation that might have once tugged at my heartstrings. But in that charged moment, my fury rose like a tempest, eclipsing any flicker of the tenderness we had once nurtured. Empathy felt like a luxury I could no longer afford, a vulnerability that had already cost me too dearly. How could I entertain compassion when the very foundation of our connection lay in ruins at her feet? She took a tentative step across the threshold, her hand outstretched as if to bridge the chasm that had yawned between us. But I could not, would not, permit her intrusion into this reclaimed territory. In a surge of instinctual defense, I placed my palms against her shoulders and propelled her backward, the force of my push more vehement than I had intended. The door crashed shut behind her with a resounding thud that echoed through the apartment like a final verdict, sealing me in solitude and her out in the cold expanse of her own making. Even as the adrenaline coursed through me, a jolt of surprise rippled through my core. This was uncharted territory, A line crossed into outright antagonism toward the woman who had cradled me through fevers and fears. Yet, in the recesses of my aching heart, justification bloomed like a bitter weed. She had forsaken me, hadn't she? In choosing this new constellation of lives, her husband's children, their needs, their noise, she had dimmed the singular light of our once indissoluble bond, leaving me adrift in the periphery of her affections. It was as if the mother I knew had evaporated, replaced by a stranger prioritizing harmony over heritage, accommodation over the daughter she had raised. In the days that unfurled like a taut wire after that explosive encounter, the fragile threads of our dialogue frayed into near silence, poisoned by an undercurrent of acrimony that seeped into every interaction. Words, when they came, were clipped and barbed, each syllable a reminder of the wounds we had inflicted upon one another. I recognized the hurt mirrored in her downcast eyes, and the way her shoulders slumped under invisible weight. My defiance had carved deep gashes into her spirit, undeniable and raw. And yet, a steely numbness had settled over me, rendering me incapable of mustering even a sliver of forgiveness or understanding. Compassion demanded a bridge I was unwilling to build, not when the rubble of our shared history still littered the ground between us. The atmosphere in the apartment thickened into something almost tangible, a crackling static that set my teeth on edge, exacerbated by the relentless barbs from my stepfather. His voice, gravelly and laced with disdain, slithered through the walls at all hours, decrying my very existence as an unwelcome intrusion, a stubborn remnant cluttering his vision of domestic bliss. "She's just causing trouble," he'd mutter to my mother, his words designed to erode my resolve, to paint me as the villain in this reshuffled narrative. With each passing day, my inner turmoil simmered to a boil, my tolerance fraying like an overused rope, stretched to the brink by the ceaseless erosion of my place in this once familiar world. The precipice of endurance finally crumbled on an ordinary afternoon that twisted into chaos, when my stepfather, emboldened by some false sense of entitlement, declared with brazen audacity that my room, my last bastion of autonomy, would henceforth belong to his offspring. The announcement landed like a thunderclap, leaving me gaping in disbelief, my mind reeling from the sheer gall of it all. This outsider, this man who had materialized in our lives like an uninvited storm, had already pillaged the intangible treasures of my youth, the unshared glances with my mother, the quiet routines that defined our duo. And now, he reached for the tangible, eyeing my corner of the world as if it were spoils of conquest, a space to be bartered away for his children's comfort. A fire ignited within me, propelling me toward him in a blaze of confrontation, my voice rising in a torrent of righteous indignation. "You have no right to storm in here and claim what's mine," I thundered, my words slicing through the air like sharpened steel, each one a bulwark against his encroachment. He waved away my fury with a dismissive flick of his hand, invoking my mother's tacit endorsement as if it were an ironclad decree, a betrayal that twisted the knife deeper into the wound of her divided loyalties. The mere notion of her complicity, that she would collude in my displacement once more, sent bile rising in my throat, a seething cocktail of rage and sorrow that blurred my vision. What began as a verbal skirmish swiftly devolved into a maelstrom of recriminations, our voices overlapping in a cacophony of hurled accusations that stripped us bare. I unleashed a barrage of vitriol, branding him an interloper of the lowest order, a man so bereft of provision that he resorted to scavenging from others' lives to prop up his own inadequacies, a leech cloaked in the guise of family. His retort came swift and stinging, painting me as an intractable child, a petulant soul shackled by an inability to embrace the inexorable tide of transformation. "You're just a spoiled girl who can't handle a little change," he sneered, his eyes narrowing with contempt that only fueled my counter-assault. The exchange left us both breathless, the air between us scorched and irreparable, a battlefield strewn with the debris of shattered illusions. Ultimately, the skirmish ebbed into a hollow victory for them, leaving me prostrate in the ashes of defeat. My mother, ever the mediator in this fractured tableau, aligned herself unyieldingly with her new partner, her tone a weary entreaty laced with expectation. She implored me to bend, to yield my grievances for the greater good of this ill-fitted clan, to carve out concessions from the remnants of my dignity. "Think of the family," she urged, as if the word encompassed the blended chaos she had wrought, oblivious to the irony that it rang hollow in my ears. But beneath her words, a deeper truth gnawed at me. I had already surrendered so much. The intimacy of our duo, the sanctity of my space, the unscarred trust that once bound us. To offer more felt like self-annihilation, a final capitulation to a narrative that marginalized me at every turn. Inflamed by this cocktail of wrath and hopelessness, I lashed out in a final desperate gambit, my threats spilling forth like venom, promises of retribution, vows to etch their indifference into the annals of consequence, their faces contorted in stunned horror, a fleeting tableau of vulnerability that did nothing to quench my fire. With a final, explosive retreat, I barricaded myself in my room once more, the doors slam a thunderous punctuation to my isolation, enveloping me in a cocoon of impotence and solitude that pressed against my chest like a leaden shroud. It was in this nadir of desolation, as shadows lengthened and despair clawed at the edges of my resolve, that a spark of recollection pierced the gloom, a lifeline woven from the fabric of forgotten security. The apartment itself, this modest two-bedroom haven squeezed into the city's relentless pulse, was no anonymous rental but a legacy bestowed by my paternal grandmother. She had deeded it to my parents in the halcyon days of their urban migration, a gesture of quiet generosity that had cradled our early struggles. Through the tempests of my youth, she had emerged as my unshakable sentinel, mending the fissures in maternal care with her steadfast presence. Stories spun over steaming tea, arms that enveloped without question, wisdom dispensed like balm on fevered skin. In the hush of that moment, her image summoned a surge of clarity. My fingers, numb with emotion, fumbled for the phone, punching in her number with the urgency of a drowning soul grasping for driftwood. When her voice, warm and familiar as hearthfire, greeted me across the line, the dam burst. I unspooled the sordid chronicle of duplicity, the bagged exile of my treasures, the insidious plot to evict me from my own corner, seeking not just catharsis, but counsel from the sole soul whose fealty had never wavered. To her, I laid bare the labyrinth of my torment, the discarded relics of my identity, the fresh assault on my refuge, the relentless erosion of belonging under the weight of this imposed kinship. Her response, a blaze of maternal outrage that crackled through the receiver, was the anchor I hadn't known I craved, a promise of reckoning that reignited the embers of hope amid the ruins. My grandmother's fury was palpable. Despite being out of the city, she promised to return in 2 days and confront my mother and stepfather, making it clear that they couldn't mistreat me without consequences. Relief flooded over me. For the first time in weeks I felt supported, knowing I had someone willing to fight for me. As I hung up the phone, I anxiously awaited her arrival, uncertain about what lay ahead but hopeful that change was on the horizon. When the doorbell rang, I hurried to answer it. My grandmother stood there, her expression fierce, eyes ablaze with anger. She had always been my protector, and I knew she wouldn't allow anyone to harm me. I had held my ground for 2 days, refusing to let them take my room. As soon as she entered the apartment, she spotted my mother and stepfather, shock etched on their faces. Without warning, she slapped my mother hard, a sudden and shocking display of violence. My mother stumbled back, clutching her cheek. When my stepfather tried to speak, my grandmother swiftly struck him on the chest. His face drained of color as he realized the strength of the force he was dealing with. My grandmother scanned the small apartment, taking in every detail. She then turned to my mother and stepfather, announcing that she was the owner of the apartment and that I was her granddaughter. Fear gripped them as they comprehended the gravity of the situation. My grandmother lectured them sternly about their mistreatment of me, her words cutting through the tension in the room. A profound sense of relief washed over me. For the first time since my mother's remarriage, I felt someone was truly on my side, fighting for my cause. The air hung heavy with tension as my grandmother's stern voice echoed through the apartment. My mother and stepfather, seething with anger and indignation, were put in their place. But my grandmother wasn't finished. "You two should be ashamed of yourselves," she declared, her voice unwavering, demanding accountability for their actions. My grandmother's scolding cut through the room like a sharp blade. "How dare you treat your own daughter this way? Throw her out of her room? It's a disgrace," she admonished, her voice filled with righteous anger. When my mother attempted to speak, my grandmother silenced her with a raised hand. "No, I don't want to hear it. Pack up your things, then take your stepchildren and get out of my apartment. I don't want to see either of you again until you learn to treat your own blood with respect." Her words hit my mother and stepfather like a wrecking ball. They stared at her, mouths agape, unable to comprehend the gravity of the situation. My mother tried to protest, explaining they had nowhere else to go, but my grandmother was resolute. With a look of fierce determination in her eyes, she stood her ground. "I don't care where you go, but you can't stay here. You can't just throw away your daughter's things and expect everything to be okay. You need to learn how to be a better mother and a better person." My mother and stepfather seemed on the verge of arguing, but my grandmother shifted her gaze to me with tenderness and concern. She assured me, "You're the only one who's staying here. I won't let them hurt you anymore. You're always welcome in my home." A whirlwind of emotions washed over me, relief, gratitude, and a twinge of guilt. My grandmother had taken a drastic step, kicking my mother and stepfather out of her home, yet I couldn't help but feel a sense of happiness at finally having someone in my corner. As my mother and stepfather hastily packed their belongings, their faces contorted with anger and disbelief, my grandmother turned to me and offered a small smile. She enveloped me in a warm embrace and said, "Don't worry, my dear. Everything is going to be okay now." It was a moment of triumph, orchestrated by my fiercely protective grandmother, who saw the injustice and took decisive action to make things right. Despite the turmoil, I found solace in her unwavering support, knowing I wasn't alone in this battle. I toiled day in and day out, pouring my sweat and effort into my work, yet my contributions went unnoticed. My family seemed to revel in spending the money I earned, but there was never any appreciation, only a spotlight on my shortcomings. My sister, for reasons I could never fathom, was consistently jealous of me. She was indolent, uninterested in work, and conveniently blamed me for her own misdeeds. My parents, in turn, readily believed her accusations, scolding me without hesitation. Life was far from fair in our household. Each time an incident occurred, my parents would remind me that I was older, expected to be more mature and responsible, while she was allowed to get away with her behavior, creating a toxic atmosphere. This had become the norm in my life, a scenario perhaps not uncommon, but what followed was truly extraordinary. One day, a heated argument erupted between my sister and me when she took my favorite dress without permission and ruined it. She displayed no remorse, dismissing it as a trivial item. However, that dress held sentimental value. It was the first thing I had ever purchased for myself with my hard-earned money. When I asserted that I wasn't her caretaker, she retorted that the family would always love her more and she'd never have to work a day in her life. I didn't grasp the full meaning of her words until a few weeks later when she stood before me, proudly announcing her teenage pregnancy. The family's reaction to this life-altering news was strikingly different from their response to my minor mistakes. It was glaringly evident that, regardless of her actions, they would unconditionally support her. Although they displayed momentary displeasure, they eventually embraced the idea, assuming it was my duty to not only take care of my sister but also her unborn child. When I inquired about the baby's father, she evaded the question. On further pressing, she burst into tears, silencing any further inquiries. The burden of responsibility fell squarely on my shoulders, while my own needs and well-being were utterly disregarded by the very people who were supposed to care for me. I attempted to reason with them, but it became abundantly clear that my words fell on deaf ears. The breaking point came when my sister openly admitted, right in front of me, that she intentionally got pregnant to make my life a living nightmare. All the emotions I had suppressed surged to the surface, yet arguing with them seemed as futile as arguing with the wind, so I kept my peace for approximately 2 months, fervently seeking a job that would whisk me away from this suffocating environment. To my delight, it happened. I secured a job 800 miles away with excellent pay. However, the moment I shared the news of my move, my family's reaction was far from supportive. They expressed their anger, bombarding me with unnecessary questions about my responsibility and the baby's future. I couldn't comprehend why I, the sibling, was being held accountable for my sister's choices while I was more than willing to assist them financially. Their expectations had crossed a line. I couldn't sacrifice my entire life to be the sole caregiver for my sister's child, despite my family's relentless efforts to sway my decision. From initial sweetness to outright yelling, I stood my ground. They resorted to emotional manipulation and gaslighting, trying to make me question my own judgment. I couldn't help but wonder if this was truly my fault, despite the fact that I had always gone above and beyond to help my family without expecting anything in return. Thank you for the supportive comments. Your encouragement means a lot. To those questioning why my teenage sister would intentionally get pregnant, expecting me to shoulder the entire responsibility, I'm just as puzzled. The most ironic part is that the father of the child was still in the picture, yet nobody expected him to step up. He was there, having lunch with my family, laughing and socializing. My family had this bizarre notion that my sister and her boyfriend were too young to handle such a significant responsibility, leaving me to foot the financial burden. I couldn't fathom why I should be responsible for their choices. They were perfectly capable of finding jobs and devising a plan to support their child if they chose to keep it. Why should I sacrifice my life for this mess? I have no clue about this guy's parents or what my sister is really up to. All I know is they're doing everything in their power to demotivate me, hoping I'll just give in and stay here. You're talking to the new tech person from my family company. Just kidding. That wasn't a great first impression, but I'm proud of myself for landing this position. Speaking of the devil, my sister is apparently in her second trimester, indicating that she was pregnant long before she announced it, and intentionally so. My family was furious when they heard I was moving and tried everything possible to stop me, even attempting to create a scene at the airport. The audacity, they're acting like I'm some neglectful mother leaving her newborn behind, while the real mother, my sister, is being treated like a typical teenager who found herself in a difficult situation. Every time I think the drama is over, more keeps coming. My family is unhinged. I can't believe how unbothered they are about this situation, behaving as if my choice to work 800 miles away is just a rebellious phase. Adding to the chaos, my mom called me yesterday, suggesting I should adopt the baby once it's born and pose as the mother so my sister can restart her education without judgment for being a teen mom. It seems like everything my family does is for her. Just when I thought they couldn't do worse, they proved me wrong. I was so fed up that I told my mom straight away that I might not even want to come back, let alone adopt the kid. I've been clear that I won't take responsibility for my sister or her child, something I've repeated for a long time, of course. My mom dismissed everything. Today a friend called me, asking about my supposed pregnancy, a rumor spread by my family. I've decided to put an end to this once and for all. I made an announcement on my social media page, exposing them completely. Yes, my family thinks I went overboard, but I simply don't care anymore. Am I the villain for this? I think not. I believe all of you are entitled to your opinion, but the way you wrote it, it's clear you'd never help your sister anyway. It's unfortunate that she's also problematic, but I can't blame just one person. I don't know how much patience God gives you all. If this situation is causing you so much trouble, cut them off. You can choose the middle ground. Your family has always treated you wrongly, so I'd say it's well deserved. Why would you take care of the baby anyway? It's insane.